Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our members and welcome to our guests. And also welcome to the people online. We're looking forward to hearing from all of you after the talk if you have questions. For the people online, if you have questions, please email them to colonialsociety@verizon.net and we will get them into the lineup after the talk. But first we have to get to the talk. And a very, very warm welcome to Jane Nylander, a long-term member of the Colonial Society. She's been a wonderful and active member since 1994. And she's going to talk to us this evening about her new book, The Best Ever New England Parades, 1788 to 1940. And she is well positioned to talk to us about this topic. She is the former president of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, the former director of the Strawbery Banke Museum, and a trustee of Old Sturbridge Village. And given this formidable background in public history, she will bring insight and understanding to the cultural importance of parades, a topic that helps illuminate the attitudes of everyday people toward issues as varied as independence, war, ethnic identity, and civic pride. So I myself encountered 2 parades this summer, and Jane and I were joking before this that everyone has a parade story. I have 2 just from this summer, and I won't go into great detail, but I saw one parade, we just stumbled upon it in the Swiss Alps, and another parade right outside the Duomo in Florence. And they were very, very different parades, needless to say, from each other and from any parade I'd ever seen before. So I'm looking forward to learning more about how to interpret parades from Jane, and I will understand better what I actually encountered this summer. So, Jane, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to share this with you all. It's the result, as many of you know, of a long and fascinating retirement project that took me all over New England into far corners looking for wonderful treasures, this kind of thing that turns up when you walk into the Lancaster, Massachusetts Historical Society and say, do you have anything about parades? And they say, well, we have this arch here that welcomed Lafayette, which isn't true. And then they bring out a box full of photographs with wonderful things like this of Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty in 1880. Lady Liberty apparently not having seen or been influenced in any way by the Statue of Liberty arriving 6 years earlier. At any rate, but it's a very simple expression of some very standard patriotic symbols. And the further we dig into this subject, the more complex presentations become and the meanings become. The more timely the topics. Annual repetition on the 4th of July or other holidays like Patriots' Day and in St. Patrick's Day really create and really reinforce ideas about what's important. And they create myth and celebrate progress. They honor individuals and illustrate inclusion. They use satire and other means for political and social commentary, and they reinforce certain ideas and popular conceptions. I thought I'd start by showing you, sort of taking you a bit on the research path I took, or mentally took, by starting with the oldest parade float I've ever found. I saw this early in my historical career at the New Haven Colony Museum, and somehow as I began to turn to parades, I remembered that they had this great ship. You can see it fills the whole gallery. They were reluctant to remove it from the glass case for photography, and I can understand why. But there it is, and I was thrilled to see that it was still there. This was supposedly found floating in the English Channel in the 1740s, and it was brought to New Haven and was pulled there in the ratification parade on July 4th, 1788. The oldest float I've seen anywhere in New England. I'm more than happy to learn about more. This was used in New Haven for the bicentennial of the city in 1838, in 1839 for the 50th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, and given to the Historical Society in 1883. And they let it back out for Monument Day in June of 1887. But by that time they called it quite a familiar sight in New Haven. But they no longer let it out at all. Described in 1788 as a federal ship with all sails flying, manned by a captain and sailors, based on the idea conceived at Boston at their rejoicing last winter, when Boston, too, had a ratification procession. Actually, here it was 48 hours after Massachusetts voted to become the sixth state to ratify on February 6th, 1788. A very small committee of Boston artisans and tradesmen and mechanics organized a celebratory procession. And I have to ask you to imagine this, because unfortunately there are no pictures. But stepping off at 11 o'clock in a light snow on Friday, February 8th, more than 1,500 men moved through the Boston Straits in occupational groups identified by white silk banners saying the name of their profession. Newspapers published extensive descriptions of this throughout the country, and that helped to set a very high bar for other ratification processions that would follow in the other states, as well as a model for future events. The line of march for the ratification procession began with 16 foresters with axes and scythes, symbolically clearing the land. And next, to underscore the idea that agriculture would be the foundation of a successful society, farming was personified by a man with a plow, followed by sowers strewing seed from baskets, reapers with sickles, mowers with scythes, haymakers with rakes, yokes of fat cattle, husbandmen with hoes, spades, and other farming utensils. There were 2 ox-drawn carts with elements of sustenance and raiment, the important things of life, clothing and food. The first was loaded with fresh cuts of beef, followed by 8 master butchers walking in clean white frocks. The other carried flax dressers carrying linen fibers for spinning. And behind them came 28 more groups of tradesmen, each man carrying the tools of his trade decorated with ribbons. And shipbuilders exhibited a sled on which was a large ship yard with 13 vessels under construction. And on another sled, of course, printers operated a press and handed out messages to the people along the road as they were produced from the press. The symbolic heart of it all was another ship, the Federal Constitution, also on runners in Boston, drawn by 13 horses representing the 13 states now united in the country. And this kind of intense symbolism follows through on many of the early parades and then gradually dissolves in other ways. Some things stick with us, some don't. When in 1789, just a year later, George Washington was elected president, he realized that he'd never been to New England, never been north of New York, in fact. And he decided to tour New England in October and November to meet the people and see a place he'd never seen and to visit with those whom he served during the Revolution. He was escorted much of the way by mounted local dignitaries who met him at every town line, escorted him through the village, the town, to whatever ceremony was there, and on to this place he stayed, and on to the next. Almost never alone. So it was in some ways a procession most of the way. In Boston, he was brought into the center of the city on a white horse, wearing a continental uniform, and arrived here at this front side of this arch that had been built specially in front of the old State House, or the existing State House at that point. The arch was designed by Bulfinch specifically for the occasion, and is not unusual at all for a processional arch to be erected for the most important parades in any of the things I will talk about this evening. We could have a whole evening on arches alone because they were framed, often covered with cloth, painted, and in varying degrees of triumph, with trophies of arms and, of course, that great eagle over the top. But the parade that George Washington was to watch come through this arch, he went up through the State House and out onto this curved balcony and watched the parade arrive, was slightly different from the ratification position, only because this time 50 groups of artisans and tradesmen did not carry their tools, but they had arranged for banners to be painted that carried the name of their profession and a symbolic image. They were alphabetically arranged. Several of the banners survived. This one is the cordwainers, men who made goatskin kid shoes, not cobblers, not repairmen, but makers of fine shoes, were number 12. These groups were, of course, partially loosely organized, some of them very seriously, and others just got together for the occasion. But some of them were based really on the London livery companies, and the cordwainers based their banner on the banner of the Cordwainers Company in London, which goes back into the 12th century. The goat heads represent the goat skins that they used for fine quality kids' shoes. And as there's a wonderful poster, a broadside that is published about this procession, which names all the different companies and some of the banner mottos. And in our family, we're particularly interested in the paper stainers, where the motto says something that appeals to those of us who are interested in the roles of women in the community. They say the paper stainers suggest that they hope the fair daughters of Columbia would deck their walls with American manufactures. Parades honor individuals, of course. And in the early Republic, of course, the biggest brouhaha was when Lafayette decided to return 50 years after the Revolution to visit tour scenes of battles, to meet with people he had seen before and veterans, and to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. And he made a large loop tour, as you're all aware, and was greeted with parades every place he went. And he came to Boston twice because of the activity at Bunker Hill. He first arrived not planning to return, but then realizing that the Bunker Hill Monument would be the cornerstone laying would be the following year, he agreed to come back a second time, and there was another procession. This banner commemorates those events, but it doesn't illustrate anything real, because by the time the Boston Bunker Hill Monument was completed, Lafayette was dead. So this wonderful banner, it was painted way down Maine for the Kennebec Guards, painted by Charles Codman in Portland, and really quite wonderful, I think. And it picked its symbols and did it very beautifully, and yet not true. Don't believe everything you see. By the time the monument was finished in 1843, there had been many parades, annually beginning actually in 1786 on Bunker Hill Day. But the parades honoring the monument and the progress of the monument continued from the time of the cornerstone laying in 24 until here it was finally finished in 43. After, I will say, the interventions of a group of ladies led by Sarah Josepha Hale, the editor of Godey's Ladies Book, who decided that the men had had 15 years to raise enough money to finish the Bunker Hill Monument, had not managed to do it, and the solution would be a ladies' fair held in the rotunda of Quincy Market. The fair was in 1840, raised over $40,000, and by 1843, thanks to that and their charitable husbands and supporters, the monument was finished. There are any number of sheet music covers that illustrate Boston parades, and this one showing the 76 Quick Step is a good example, I think, showing the finished monument with the flags at the top. If you ever wonder why those holes are there, and some days we even do see flags put out there. And here, gathered at the base of the monument, the assembled group of people celebrating the occasion. Interestingly, I think, because there's an array of banners that were commissioned by various groups, and among the ones that are legible are the Oddfellows, the Mass Charitable Mechanics Society, and the Bunker Hill Monument Association. I can't read the text on all the others. Many veterans of the Revolution appeared. There were 61 different military groups, including the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, in their continental dress. President Tyler and his sons participated. And the streets were jammed with men, and women and children were in the windows and on the balconies most of the time. Some men were on rooftops. And they all gathered around Daniel Webster again as he gave a dedicatory address, this time an hour and 56 minutes long, with meaningful content. The man shown in the daguerreotype is one of the Revolutionary vets who came to this occasion. This is George Fishley of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in what's left of his continental uniform, mainly the hat. And by this time, he was a very professional Revolutionary War veteran. He went to many different occasions and happily was photographed, so we have some sense of what he looked like. But banners were used for all kinds of reasons, not to identify the groups, to be sure, but also to advocate causes. I love this one, to express an opinion that is really something probably fairly important today. Was the Boston Young Men's Whig Club in Boston in 1848 that shows a lawyer at the right holding and he has one hand going out to a copy of the Constitution and the laws, and then on the other side is a younger person, a youth, in work clothes, but holding a square, symbolizing the need for order and action. And all of us can appreciate the motto, no abuse of power. Hold fast the law. I suggested to the Revolutionary Spaces that they actually get this out and take a better photograph and use it for activities, banners, and T-shirts in the coming year, but they have, as you could guess, at the moment, no, nothing. Fragile silk banners were displayed on all kinds of occasions, and this wonderful group from Portland, Maine, was created for the Maine Charitable Mechanics Association. There were 17 done for them and used in any number of parades in Portland, and remained in the association's headquarters until just a few years ago, when they were sold at a really thrilling auction, when a consortium of Maine museums pooled their resources to buy the whole set and keep them together. So they stay at the Maine Historical Society rather than going to different folk art collectors everywhere. Temperance, of course, was a huge cause beginning at this time, and you can see that the hatters with their beaver indicate that they believe in temperance, and the shipwrights have a flag for temperance, feeling good about the fact that grog would no longer be distributed twice a day to sailors. And temperance groups grew enormously in the 1830s and 40s. And by 1844, this huge convention of temperance advocates, the Washingtonians, was gathered on the Common for a day-long festival, and which was accompanied by a splendid parade, and through the city and then back to the Common. And let me use the cursor just to, let's see if I can give it all away. go back? Yes, there. I wanted to suggest that it starts with the music, and then the big long band and soldiers, then the president, or the most important person present in a carriage, and comes around here, banners with every group. But what I find fascinating is the two floats. The old oaken bucket with the big well sweep from Samuel Woodward's 1817 poem of the old oaken bucket, which is used in parade after parade after parade. But here, as early as this, I haven't ever seen a picture of any other. And then on the other float is the lifeguards in a life-saving boat, again, presumably celebrating the elimination of grog. Temperance also appears as a prime theme in the celebration of the Boston Water celebration in 1848, at the end of October. In one way, this is a celebration of progress, of community services, of public water supply, of water piped through wooden logs from Lake Cochituate. But it also was a parade of many, many, many temperance organizations who came by train and marched with banners throughout the city celebrating pure water. Many of the banners had fountains pasted on them. And that huge arch between the Boston Museum and the Tremont Hotel was designed by Hammett Billings for the procession for the water celebration. And you can see, in that case, a huge ship coming through the arch as well, led by a group of Masonic officers wearing their jewels and carrying the tools of the office. The Marine Division followed them with this great sloop pulled by 8 horses, called a full-rigged sloop of war, 26 feet long, built by the Navy Yard, manned by 25 men from the ship Franklin. I want to ask you to imagine, again, another one of these groups. Can you imagine this? These are arranged by trade. The Charitable Mechanics Association and numerous similar institutions. There was considerable display. The first was a car bearing a clock store, Beals, with the motto, "Time is money," attributed to Franklin, an elegant show. One of Honeyman's superb fire engines, rolls of W.R. Tenney's carpeting. The Junior Tailors Society on a car with Adam and Eve standing by a tree and the serpent twined around the trunk among the branches. There were rare specimens of statuary and primitive tailoring. An Oak Hall was represented by a beautiful little car with clothing, complete and incomplete. The bakers bore a good-sized loaf above their banner. And then came a car with a painting of 2 mammoth steers raised in Sutton, Massachusetts. The marketman had something which drew out cheers, loud and deep, a full-size stall such as they have at Faneuil Hall, borne on a car of suitable dimensions, filled with the choicest joints and cuts of beef, mutton, pork, lamb, veal, poultry, cheese, butter, fish, and vegetables of the rarest kinds. And Mr. Partridge, who is largely engaged in the manufacture of artificial flowers, had a rural car for this division containing 12 young girls, beautifully dressed in white, exhibiting specimens of their tasteful manufacture. Could we ever see that or anything like it? I'm happy to tell you we really can. Because in Gleason's in a pictorial drawing room companion in 1851, wood engravers managed to produce this astonishing double-page spread of the full procession of the Railroad Jubilee. Moving from the I'm sorry, I don't understand why that does that. The men clearing the way by carrying a stick to move the crowd back so there's enough room for the parade to proceed through the street, followed by soldiers, leaders, different groups. You can identifiable by the light infantry by their various hats And then around here you find the president in his car and the Governor General of
Your cursor's not working, so don't try it. Your cursor's not working.
I see. Can you see it up there?
Yes.
You can
see your cursor.
Well, then I'll stop fussing with it because I honestly thought I was helping you.
Right.
Thank you for telling me. So beyond that, wind your way up beyond the carriage, and you begin to see the great sculpture of the wounded Indian that has been at the Chrysler Museum for many, many years. Another great big ship, an elephant from Barnum's museum, says Barnum on the side, presumably taxidermy. Let me go along. A big volcano. There's one of the Faneuil Hall butcher's shops going horizontally there, and goes on to a locomotive, fire engines, and on and on and on and on. The book published to describe this occasion is 288 pages long. And it's a wonderful testament to the industrial and commercial vigor of Boston at the time. Goes on into groups of cultural organizations and ends up with 4,000 school children. In the distant blur there are the kids. Now, I mentioned the soldiers. I'm sorry, I've never used this kind of thing before. You're probably aware that the Federal Militia Act, we certainly all ought to be aware at this point, in 1791 and 2 required all white men ages 18 to 45 to participate in military training days twice a year, providing their own uniforms and their own arms. And these became very festive occasions as people gathered to watch the drilling and marching, to listen to the shot firing of cannon, and to enjoy the fruits of all the various shops and booths that set up around the training field. This is George Rope's painting of an 1808 training day on Salem Common. As good as you can get for an early view of one of these things. The actual parade is the drilling within the common, but this is something that happened twice a year everywhere. And for the first 30 so years after the War Act was passed, it was observed with respect and real dedication and professional military behavior. And to participate in something like this, the elite companies, the ones who were most proud of their appearance and had the highest status, paid for very expensive uniforms, paid for expensive armaments, drilled on a very regular basis, and that it would not be at all uncommon to see parades of militia like the Ancient and Honor Artillery seen here opposite the Tremont Hotel in 1829. There are the whole range of sheet music covers that show them in front of historic Boston landmarks, Old North and Berry Street and so forth. An interesting array of newly available lithography and popular singing produces the combination of the same thing, but they're always admiring the best soldiers. But for men who didn't have the highest status, didn't have the money to participate in the volunteer companies, or the social status, I guess, there were enrolled companies where men appeared in their own clothes rather than uniforms, often patched, sometimes confronted with a rather pompous leader. The lower drawing here is by David Clopill Johnson. It shows Boston in 1828 with a rather disgruntled-looking group of men who are not really very serious about the militia. They're teasing him. One of them has holding a cornstalk instead of a gun. One has a broom. One has a hat on the end of a bayonet. Some of their patched clothes. Some of them are already drunk. It's not quite as snappy as the Ancient and Honorables, right? It was a really different thing. There had been no call for these men to serve in any way since the War of 1812. This was something they were supposed to do twice a year, it was sometimes fun, and clearly it was sometimes not. So you begin to have all kinds of satirical attacks on or parodies of Militia Day. And the little group in the drawing at the top comes out of a Boston almanac in 1832. It's called Standing Company, and they're marching along there with absolutely no focus or drill or anything. It suggests how they used the time on a day when they were required to show up and not. And this changes into something really interesting, a very regional expression of criticism, comment, and as the old days dissolve into chaos, throughout New England, not just in Boston, even in tiny towns, groups of men and boys begin to appear often as early as 5 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of July, arranged in quasi-military companies, sometimes wearing the old family uniform, grandfather's Revolutionary War costume or old uniform, whatever's around, and they begin to march, making as much noise as they possibly could, with loud drums, and they were quickly known as horribles. They started off calling themselves the Fantastics or the Imagineers or the Squizzleers. In New Bedford, they were called the Bungtown Invincibles. There are a whole range of varied names through the 1840s. But by 1850 or so, they're called the Horribles or the Antiques and Horribles. Antiques because they're wearing the old uniforms, and Horribles. And it becomes a classic New England expression of 4th of July in some places, but not everywhere. Sometimes they were wearing blackface or there was cross-dressing. Often they were completely masked. And they made a point of getting the oldest, most bony horse and rickety old carriages and turning out for the 4th of July. This is a group in Stoddard, New Hampshire in 1859. Interesting to me because they were organized by a woman, not a man. I don't think she appears in this picture, but she organized them to go out in Stoddard. No, she's not in that dress. It's a masked man, interestingly, with a hoop skirt. There's nobody in that picture wearing bloomers, which I think is interesting because often they are making hits at bloomer girls in the 1860s. But you see they have 3 of them with military officer uniforms and some kind of a band. Somebody's brought his son. Some of them are holding great, huge swords. There's a man with a big, huge belly, but not wearing a skirt, so he's not mocking pregnancy. The couple in the carriage have a baby. They're both men. One is in female dress, and they are emigrating from New England going west, and they've packed all their goods with them. And you see that again and again. They're headed for Colorado. They're headed for the Black Hills. They're in the gold rush, year after year after year. This is just one example, and I've probably turned up 35 or so photographs of these things. And the newspaper comments are extraordinary as they describe everybody and every hit and every topic. They go after the police. They go after the water commissioner. Anybody who's a standout character in town or political figure is mocked. And the term is called, they make hits. In Charlestown, in 1875, the year, on Bunker Hill Day, of course, the year before the whole country began to turn itself inside out for the centennial, New England gets to celebrate a year early. So Bunker Hill Day gets a very elaborate treatment that particular year. And don't be surprised, there were horribles there as well. This group started at 5 in Charlestown. And I'd asked you to, and there apparently was a large delegation from Lynn and from Revere. Now imagine all these people coming from Lynn and Revere in costume and getting across the river by 5 o'clock in the morning to spring forth and surprise people with this elaborate procession. People in a tumbrel in the front, how or why is hard to say. The marshal has a huge sword saying the sword of Bunker Hill on it. And then there is a Calathumpian band, a discordant, noisy bunch of people making a lot of noise, more than music. Again, cross-dressing, the group of people in what I would call aesthetic dress, in pleated skirts and pointy-toed shoes like Patience and Gilbert and Stuart Sullivan's picture. And then the cart, don't miss, Woodhull Free Lovers. This is for Victoria Woodhull, who ran for candidate as the U.S. president in 1872 for the Equal Rights Party. And the men in these processions had a great time with Victoria Woodhull. A little later, other suffragettes as well. Her platform was free love, pacifism, women's rights, and suffrage. And at 5 a.m. in Charlestown on Bunker Hill Day, try and weave that together and make sense out of it. I'm not sure I can. It becomes its own thing and continues for generations in New England. The discordant music and the Calathumpian bands goes on. This is over in Springfield, Massachusetts. Everybody masked, wearing the oldest, oddest stuff they can find. I hate to think what it sounded like. And for a long time, these things had real specific focus, and they'd made a point of mocking certain ideas and individuals. And then it sort of dissolves into something that is just truly horrible. The women aren't even interested. Notice that. They stand beside it and aren't even paying any attention at all. The tradition continues today, as some of you are aware. Some of it is thoroughly disgusting. There are still people who say they've never heard of this, and there are people locally who say they've never heard of it. And when I first started my research and first began to discover some of this, I talked with Abbott Cummings about it. He had never heard of it because he grew up in an island in Vermont. But I've for a long time I was keeping a list of who's never heard of it. And it was really amazing. And to this day, I talk with people who live in towns within 10 or 15 miles of a place that still has a horrible procession. They don't know anything about it. So it's truly New England. But that covers that. But I'm really been interested in how things change and how the images of some of these things change. And so I wanted to just suggest that we start off with Liberty in classical robes with an eagle, and then by the time I took this in New Haven on St. Patrick's Day in 2013, you have something totally different for Liberty, of course, based on the Statue of Liberty, which comes in 1886. And then in probably the most grand float I know anything about is this in Augusta, Maine in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. Up on the top of an eagle, and under him a Indian princess. They've often viewed as the epitome of America in the first half of the 19th century. And then symbols, women dressed in white with sashes that indicate they honor the Army, the Navy, agriculture, commerce, and the laws. And come down a row, and you have 36 girls in white, each representing a different state, with the name of a state on a ribbon across her breast. An interesting thing was that includes the newest state that came in during the war, and also all 11 of the Confederate states which had rejoined the country after the war. This is July of '65, and they have the Confederate states included, and to symbolize it, the girls linked arms, which I think is pretty powerful in an expression. But imagine this thing wobbling across that field, pulled by 8 horses, and then onto the dirt roads of Augusta, and circling through that hillside town as it made the 4th of July procession. There's a lot of ambition here. The idea of representing the number of states goes back at least to 1800, if not 1798, but it continues, and it gets to be harder to do every year as you have more states. So here in Thomaston, Maine, you have the states with the figure of liberty in 1887, 38 states, again in matching hats and diagonal sashes, but they need a pretty big wagon to get all those girls going. So in some way, and that continues, but of course it's easier to do the 13 colonies. So the DAR in Newport in 1916 mounted this group of women as the 13 colonies, with what else? The DAR logo, a spinning wheel, suggesting domesticity and so forth. But we go back to the 19th century for a moment. A lot of the parades have large numbers of firemen in them, absolutely from the beginning, often with the fire engines decorated with flowers, mostly done by the wives of various firemen. But firemen seem to enjoy displaying their equipment and their uniforms so much that they very quickly began having their own parades, which usually ended up at a large public field where they engaged in a competition called a muster to see how far they could pump the water, how high they could pump the water, to demonstrate their strengths. But here they are in Portland, Maine in 1846. 5 companies on Portland Street. And this is a daguerreotype. It's just an extraordinary picture. The artist advertised in the newspaper that they were going to do it, and they asked everybody to please stand still as long as possible so they could get a good exposure. And I began to see this, and as I studied this topic, I read, of course, many newspapers about the 4th of July, and I was discover that in 1866, on the 4th of July, everything in this picture burned. Portland lost 10,000 buildings. It was terrible. No, 1,500 buildings, 10,000 people were homeless. It was really awful. But we also have interest in narrative floats. The earliest pictures I've seen come in, again, wonderful Gleason's Pictorial Companion. These are both in Danvers, Massachusetts, illustrating primary themes in 19th century parades: history and business. Governor Endicott's descendants in the wagon, and then the shoe shop industry we proper. And the narrative floats very often begin with a chronological series. And indeed, I hit something wrong. Can I go back? Ooh, wait a minute. No, it's not touch screen. Any recommendations?
Should be able to go back.
It's not going back. I don't know how to get rid of that screen. It's so sensitive. I'm sorry. I have no idea. I can see them. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So you start with the Indians in a domestic scene. You use the teepees and the women there too. But then, I think it's interesting, Columbus. Both of those drawings are watercolors done by a bookseller in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who compiled 93 views of parade floats during the 1850s and put them in a book that was never published called The Floral Architect. But we have them at the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and they're, as you can see, naive and charming and occasionally quite boring. Some of them tremendously interesting. But I think interesting that I've been able to compare a lot of them to the newspaper accounts of the 1850s parades, and so I know that certain ones actually were built and used. And the landing of Columbus was one. Head's design is pretty typical for a discovery. Not all that interesting a composition, but there it is. But the controversy over who owns Columbus Day began in the late 19th century when Benjamin Harrison declared it a national holiday, and special attention was paid in schools to celebrating Columbus Day. And in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1892, the Swedish-American community entered this Viking ship in the colonial Columbus Day parade, essentially claiming we were here, exclaiming we were here first. And I've seen other examples of that with Swedish-American groups in Columbus. The early 1890s examples of Columbus usually show Spanish costume. And Head talks about the costumes being in Spanish costumes, which will take us back to the days of discovery. But by 1930s, there's a very active Italian effort to commemorate Columbus Day, really in response to anti-Italian discrimination in the 20s. Here in Connecticut, in Centerville, Connecticut, in 1935, at the time of the Connecticut Tercentenary, you have a group of 3 different Italian-American societies produce this great version of the Santa Maria, with its mast shortened so they can get under the electric wires. Mm-hmm. And they've abandoned Renaissance costume. These gentlemen are in their business suits as successful Americans, but not at all hiding the ethnicity of their origin. But enough of that. The chronological procession of floats in historical parades, of course, often, if not with Columbus, starts with the Pilgrims. And in Bennington, Vermont, they were well aware of the importance of the Pilgrims in 1920, but they decided that there was competition rising in Virginia, and so they decided to include this in their July 4th procession in 1907, when the Jamestown Exposition was celebrating the first settlements in Virginia. North Bennington mounted Pilgrims, and Priscilla decided, obviously, to sit on the rock because there's not much to hang on to on that float as it goes by. Many communities honored their founders. Here in Newburyport, you have a wonderful float designed no less by Glenn Tilly Morse, who was an antiquarian, author, and the president of the local historical society, who has given himself the starring role, standing as John Winthrop in costume, holding what was then known as a Bible box, supposedly containing the charter, and he is presenting it to, presenting it to Endicott, who is reaching for the shore. Earlier this evening, there were some conversations about witches in Salem and myth. And interesting, I think, that in 1930, Boston was celebrating the tercentenary, and a long, long parade was mounted. And instead of relying on local designers to produce the floats, they hired a New York company that built funhouse attractions and laugh-in-the-dark things to build, and they also made parade floats for Mardi Gras and other places. But they hired Messmore and Damon to do 30 floats, and this is what they came up with for witches. And for those of you who were interested and concerned about the cats and the pumpkins on Mount Vernon Street tonight, here's a good example of what New York thought Boston witches should be depicted as in 1930. Of course, the tableau floats continue to commemorate everything significant in national and local history. In Concord, of course, on Patriots' Day and April 19th, you see versions of this particular scene again and again. In this case, it's 1925 in a snowstorm, but the Patriots and regulars are at the North Bridge. And other things continue to be repeated again and again and again. Not so much a tableau, but here, for example, groups based on the Spirit of 76 painting up in Abbott Hall at Marblehead. The older one is Dedham, in 1876, and the one below is Concord, New Hampshire, 50 years later. And the availability of commercialization of floats comes down to patriotic themes as well. And you see a dramatic change as people try to completely cover an automobile and produce something that will actually appear to float instead of being hauled by horses or trucks. And I included this one because it shows Betsy Ross in a somewhat sylvan setting, stitching away. But in the little center image, you can see the catalog illustration, which indicates that you can buy all the yards of ruffling to go on the car, you can buy the garment, you can buy the garment, you can rent Betsy's dress. It's completely commercial, an entirely different point of view. And for me, that changes parades tremendously. It's interesting, but I'm still interested in the things that individuals developed and how they expressed their ideas through these floats. Lots of cliches, again and again and again, lots of popular stereotypes. Log cabins everywhere, although they are not powerful New England symbols. Here an example produced by the Grange in Elliott, Maine in 1910, with 4 yokes of oxen and farmers, a big pine tree. After all, it's Maine, the pine tree state. The furniture is described as, of course, handmade. The raccoon skins are hanging on the outside of the building, and the 4 men are demonstrating sawing and splitting and carrying wood. And there's a fireplace and some smoke coming out of the chimney, and not a sign of a woman. They had a completely different float for women in this parade with a huge kitchen of olden days. What else? But Head shows us some ideas about women's work as well, which I think are quite interesting. And we can contrast 2 floats that he assembled. And these did appear in Portsmouth parades 3 separate times in the 1850s. Female accomplishments of 1776 with this finial of a spinning wheel up on the very top of it. And spinning wheel, someone knitting, someone making a braided rug, which is, of course, not something the woman did in 1776, but at any rate, in 1856, he thought they did. And then, I'm not think he's quite so sure that women's accomplishments in 1857 are something he admires. This is all frivolous. There's nothing dedicated and productive here in this float that's crowned with an arrangement of flowers. And one is engaged in art, painting, one is playing the piano, and one is studying French with a male tutor. And other examples contrast then and now on the same float. And here in Lynn in 1929, General Electric has loaded up a float with, on the left side, a view of an 18th century kitchen with someone sitting at a spinning wheel, which makes no sense, and the iron spindle has no thread on it. It is aimed right at her head. And then on the other behind her is a huge roaring fireplace, and there are a couple of children suggesting life and work for her. And on the other side, a young lady in a short skirt, a cotton dress, is reading between a raft of General Electric appliances, a vacuum cleaner, a toaster, an electric stove, and a refrigerator, everything that will make her life possible, and even hinting that she has no children. Perhaps she's even using birth control. Things are different from time to time. I showed you earlier the shoe shop from Danvers. This is a closer view of the 9-footer, just to go back to business. After the Civil War, the groups of tradesmen are no longer carrying their tools. They're illustrating their products. And you see very quickly that anybody who has a fleet of delivery wagons and a group of employees can produce an elaborate entry in the parade. This is Walter Corey in the Portland Centennial Procession in 1886. He had 13 teams on which his staff had built these tiered racks to display their products of all kinds of household furniture. It was a 50-year-old firm. One was devoted to their oldest furniture, and the rest to new products, all for sale right then and there. The men are not in their work clothes, they're dressed in Sunday best. And other times, instead of products, there are symbolic objects that are used. And of course, a mortar and pestle has long been a symbol of an apothecary or a drugstore, which in this case is a historic drugstore, 40 years old in Brunswick, Maine, but also selling all kinds of toiletries and fancy articles and perfume, of course embellished with elaborate ornamental packaging to make it sell better. And some places built extraordinary things for the parade. This is the Vim tricycle made by the Boston Hose and Rubber Company to display the durability of their rubber tires. And a small crew of men rode this thing to parades variously 100 miles radius around Boston for about 10 years. What ultimately happened, I don't know. This is in Concord, New Hampshire, right in front of the State House. And in Connecticut, for the tercentenary, Seth Thomas produced, what else? A mantle clock. But there were 300 advertising floats in the 300th procession. An enormous crowd. And, I mean, the volume of this stuff is extraordinary and impressive when you see how it expresses the community. There are other kinds of parades, floats as well, that are tremendously interesting, I think. The White Mountain towns of North Conway and Littleton had hotel parades in the 1890s up till World War I, where the various hotels competed against each other for the most elaborate, the most beautiful, the most whatever parade float. These are both in North Conway. You can see them in the valley there of the Saco right in front of Moat Mountain. The upper one is Cleopatra's Barge, which was shipped up from Portland by rail to North Conway. And the lower one was the second prize winner in this parade. Cleopatra wasn't even a winner, but the second prize winner is called an Empire Bridal Coach. And I hope you can see that the lower window just above the horse is the window in the door of the coach, and all the rest of that is built on top of the coach. And then all of this is put together with 10,000 paper roses made by hotel guests who were pretty bored in the last week of August in New Hampshire. 6 white horses, what else? All the staffing in men who usually were burly mountain drivers taking these people on trips to see the mountains and waterfalls, had to dress in these costumes for parade day, and then they were in white and silver as well. This is produced by Wentworth Hall Hotel, which is still going, and I think is quite wonderful. Howard Mansfield read my manuscript as I was looking for input, and he just couldn't believe that this was only the second prize winner. He said, surely they needed to be first. Other kinds of things come along. That's tissue paper. But soon, in 1890s, come crepe paper, and that transformed parades as well. And another new thing is children's doll carriage parades. And here, I think, a wonderful arrangement of dolls in Deering Park in Portland. The prize winner was the young lady in the kimono. The middle one was second prize, and then the right-hand one, the third prize, with the little kid with the swan. Her mother had made good use of this crepe paper guidebook of how to, and you can see the design for that swan, which was in that book, which I have put the cover on in this particular thing. After the war, or before the war, preparedness is a major theme, and you see efforts to get kids involved in thinking about what would be involved, to build up a spirit of patriotism and be prepared for catastrophe. This is all crepe paper, boys dressed as doughboys and girls as nurses, and patient as well. And then in 17, Woodrow Wilson proclaims Flag Day, and the motto for that year's parades everywhere was "Stand by the President." And here in a tiny little town, part of Brookfield, Massachusetts, called Podunk, is the school with Uncle Sam, with the few children in that school, and perhaps the teacher as well, and still a horse-drawn float. You see the horses a long time, even after cars have arrived. After the war, of course, there were great celebrations. Here is Columbia in Bath, Maine, on Armistice Day in 1919. It wasn't celebrated with parades in the year of the armistice. It happened on November 11th. It was getting late, it was cold, but the following year the parades were enormous and everywhere. And Columbia is followed by a long line of veterans. And in the same year, the Red Cross symbolized their activity during the war, the big effort of the Red Cross in every country. And here one woman is dressed in her Red Cross wartime uniform, and all the others are wearing supposedly the native dress of countries in which they had served, and are holding ribbons that attach them to proclaim their loyalty to the Red Cross. And the idea of the greatest mother in the world comes from the recruiting poster and advertising poster of the Red Cross itself from 1915. As we went on through the 40s, there was continuing concern about, again, a rise of war after the relief of 1918, the war that was supposed to end all wars. But in the 30s, that was not quite so clear. And so the places like Bath Iron Works were really actively involved in producing war material. And I think probably the sheet metal workers were relieved to stop for a few days and produce this float for their children in the Labor Day parade in 1934. But patriotic symbols were powerful and important, and they really guided the parades through the 30s. And I think there's none more impressive than the idea of a living flag. This is, let me see as I can remember. This is 1933, the National Recovery Act parade, affirming faith in economic recovery and the prosperity of the country. 200 women who worked in the worsted department of the Amoskeag Mills in Manchester wore red, white, or blue dresses or capes and hats and marched together in this parade over a very long route on what was supposed to be the best NRA parade in all of New Hampshire that year. And this thing, of course, imagine them walking for a mile or more, maybe two. They kept in step and they kept together and maintained the view of the flag. But it's only really visible from a high point, from the second floor or from a church steeple. And I think we're fortunate that the person who chose to photograph it got them in front of the lovely Gothic City Hall in Manchester. It's wonderful. After parades, in reading about them, I found again and again and again comments like, was the greatest ever seen here. That was a most impressive show. Or the one I found most often was the best ever. And that's why I named the book that. So despite their ephemeral quality, they really illustrate a lot about our country. And I've had great fun studying them, and I know you will enjoy seeing them with new eyes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was absolutely terrific. I've
Thank you.
often thought that you could write a really interesting cultural history from what appeared in the movies and which movies were nominated
Sure.
and won for the
Yeah.
Academy Awards. You now make me realize we can go much further back.
Sure.
And parades do very similar
Absolutely.
things
Yeah.
in terms of learning about the culture. So thank you. Just fascinating.
You're welcome.
Let's open up the floor for questions. Anyone have a question for Jane? Yeah.
You had all those arches that you shared that were very
Pardon me?
When you had all the arches that were shared in the parades, you said they were common to build them. Were they built as temporary structures?
They were built as, this question is about arches. Were they built as, I'm to repeat for people at a distance. They were built as temporary structures, yes. And I'm not aware that they lasted any length of time at all. I was asked to do an article about them for the Portsmouth 400th anniversary book that's just coming out next week. And I went back through any key date I could think of in Portsmouth when there was a major event at the Navy Yard, or the Russo-Japanese Treaty and the Kearsarge, Alabama celebration and so forth. And I found that there were arches every single time, not just one single great arch in the center of Market Square, but they would be in various neighborhoods and at major intersections. So at the entrance to the town, and maybe half a dozen or 8. And then some people put them at the entrance to their own property. They seem to be wooden structures on which fabric is stretched and nailed, and then the designs are painted on. So indeed, temporary. The picture I found most interesting that I was able to get into the book was one in Worcester, which showed that they had gas lights going up and then in circles above, 2 below and 1 above a great arch. And there were 5 of those in Worcester in 1 year. And remember, those are going to be all open flames. Wow. The year after Worcester had established a coal gas factory. Fascinating. But there are great pictures. But civic decoration with not just arches, but drapery and flags and so forth is a whole other subject that is growing on me.
Jane, my wife's family comes from Gloucester.
Mm-hmm.
And back for many years, more than I wish to remember, she marched in the Horribles Parade in Gloucester. And I've sort of lost touch, but are Horribles parades peculiar to New England? And do they still exist?
They do indeed still exist. Gloucester had a fine time when, remember the teen pregnancy scandal in Gloucester? That was featured in a Horribles parade in Gloucester that year. Remember I said they get pretty disgusting. Yes, they are very much a New England phenomenon. I found there are a few in the Middle West, far west, in Utah with the Mormons that came from New England in the 1860s, which Laurel Ulrich pointed me to. And of course, thanks to the wonders of newspaper search, you can discover all kinds of things. I found that they were produced in Civil War camps of New England soldiers. And their officers might or might not be familiar with Horribles Parade, but they often mocked their officers in the Horribles Parade in those, or their accommodations in those places. There also are 4 or 5 instances I found of them in Hawaii, again, where New Englanders went in the mid-19th century. But they are not well known anywhere else. I grew up in Ohio and came to camp in New Hampshire every summer. And I learned about Horribles Parades when I was a counselor, and I was supposed to get my cabin to be in a Horribles Parade. And I had completely forgotten about it until I started this project, and then I remembered it, that I was with a group of New England kids and they knew all about it and what it should be, and I hadn't a clue. So it's very much regional, I think. Yes?
North Shore, we have them in Wenham and Sale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They have them in New Hant. Yeah, yes. They have, yeah,
know about them before.
Yeah.
And Beverly Farms.
Yeah. Well, so they're going up the coast,
Yeah.
and they do go further up the coast. I made a whole long list in the book about where I have, but you know, every time I go out and talk, someone else says, "Well, you know, we have them too." But then these things were held quiet. So, you know, I'm quite sure that sometimes the men who were in them disbanded at 10, went and changed their clothes, and went in them as leaders in the primary civic procession of a community, or went to read the Declaration of Independence. There's it's just very clear in the descriptions of who's doing what and the timing that the same men are involved, leaders, but they're also whole gangs of young guys as well. They start off very actively in Burlington, Vermont, where there are college kids, and they start in Lowell and Lawrence, where there are young people working in the mills who would be easy, they need something to do in the evening and get involved in this kind of activity. It's extraordinary how it develops,
So
but it's
do you think-
rich.
Do you think today they're mostly for young children?
No,
That's-
they're adult.
Because that's what I see in the hub.
Yeah.
Do you? Well, see, well, then there are regional differences.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very much adult. And they're very much adult topics anymore. hmm I mean, it's less aimed at the existing government or the water commissioner than it was in 1880. In Hingham, I should back up. Starting in the 1850s, Benjamin Shillaber, who was the editor of the Boston Post, started a column about a man named Yehiel Stebbins, who was supposedly a commander in the Aroostook War. And he had supposedly won all kinds of battles and so forth. And very quickly, Yehiel Stebbins and his marching group become featured in Horribles parades in greater Boston area. And they catches hold in Hingham for some reason, the Stebbins Rangers. And by 1870s, they are presenting Yehiel Stebbins with a silver tea set because the whole thing is bogus. There was never anybody like that. It is completely farce thing that is present, and it shows up on 4th of July, all kinds of places. Yes.
So, Jane, the collection of images that you've assembled is absolutely amazing. I'm floored. But my question has to do with relevancy to today, because parades continue, they continue to evolve. Why do you think we still have parades? Why do you think they're still popular?
Well, those who do them love them, first of all. There are some people who will not give up anything. Parades have changed. I mean, where do you see 5,000 men or people marching together anymore? Even the band is in a wagon anymore. I mean, things have changed dramatically, but there's still an effort to put these parades together. Old Home Day in New Hampshire is the second Saturday of August every year, and there's some of the parades have the most creative floats that are going. But others are as boring as they can be, like the Memorial Day parade, where they can barely get the junior high school band to walk down the street 2 blocks. I mean, some places have it and some places don't.
Well, Bristol.
Yeah.
We were there during COVID, so it was only 4 hours,
Uh-huh.
whereas opposed to like the 7 or 8 hours that it usually is considered what the longest.
Bristol has declared itself the oldest parade.
Is
Yeah.
that correct? Okay. But it is amazing.
It does go back to the 1790s. I'm not going to argue that. Whether they skipped a year or not, I don't think they can prove.
They won't admit it.
It doesn't matter. Pittsfield decided that in, I think, the late 70s, that they wanted to draw more attention to the city, so they declared themselves New England's Parade City and began launching large subsidized parades to draw people. And the people who developed these big business parades, the committees were happy because they didn't have to spend any time soliciting anybody to participate. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to pay anybody to be in the parade. The businesses assumed all the responsibility, and they filled the parade, and everybody in town was happy. Not much cost, but they vary.
I want to say, first of all, thank you for this talk. This has been really incredible. A question that I had was, I guess, about your findings about race in parades in New England.
About
About race in general, I guess. I was really interested to see, like, all of the ways that the white participants in the parades you describe are, you know, like, using races as costumes and enacting these kind of mythologies they have of people of other races, you know, like whether that's the Horribles using blackface or whether that's parade floats depicting Native Americans. And I didn't get a chance to look super closely, but it seemed that many of the people in the pictures in the parades, if I'm like reading this correctly, are white primarily. And I was curious, like, did you find any anecdotes about the participation of non-white people in parades? Like, would there have been segregated roles? Were there controversies about integration in parades?
I don't think early. The question is about integration in parades and how racism is expressed. I don't see deliberate exclusion of anybody because I see them. The announcement that the parade is coming is made publicly, and anyone who wishes to participate is invited to come. However, the organizing committees often choose the groups that will, and they set up the order. So there is very specifically one structure. But there are areas where people are invited to participate, and there are areas where you see representations of individual subcommunities. The earliest example of any parading that I see by black people as an independent community in New England is in the parades in the early 19th century that celebrate the abolition of the slave trade in 1808. And they continue to, they parade to celebrate that, and there are a whole bunch of rather awful racist broadsides that illustrate those parades. And there are just vivid descriptions in the newspaper, which are pretty snotty in the way they describe them. But there clearly was a celebratory factor, and the people participating did it year after year. So, but I don't see that happening again for a long, long time.
Kate, I think we'll take one more question.
In my work, whether I've looked at the treatment of loyalists or in the 19th century at labor riots, I found myself spending a lot of time thinking about what is the distinction between an assembly of persons and a mob. And so when I was thinking about your project, I was thinking, did you find that you had to draw some parameters around what is a parade versus what is a rally or a protest march?
Well, I decided I was interested in the floats as folk art and what they tell about the country, about the people who produce them and the society in which they're shown. And I tried to stick to that, and so I left out commencement, I left out religious processions, I left out all Labor Day parades, I left out all kinds of things, which are in many ways processions. If you would say the procession is the line of people, the parade has in it, in addition, has other visual qualities. That's where I landed. I have probably 2,000 images that could have been used. I used 300. But I decided I would just take those as a lens because, as you can see, they tell extraordinary things that we just don't think about the culture. And what I want is for this to stir some people up to do some more, do more. I'm not going to do another one. I got the most fabulous additional picture yesterday. People keep sending me stuff. You know, it's not going to end. But I'm not going to do another volume. But there's great material there for people who are interested in this topic, and I am happy to share.
Well, Thank you, Jane. I think
You're
you've
welcome.
inspired us all, absolutely, and to understand parades better than ever.
Fun to do.
If you're interested, the book is right here. You can take a peek at it. It's absolutely beautiful. It has all those illustrations in it, and I'm sure Jane would be happy to answer more questions one-on-one. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.